ask you a question. What do white people do wrong, Larry Elder?
What do you mean? What do white people do? I'm not worried about white people. I'm worried about what's going on with
But
us.
if there's systemic racism in this country, which we
I,
know
I
it is.
no, I don't say there is. You say there is. I don't believe that.
Oh, you don't believe there's
No,
systemic
there used to
racism?
be, obviously.
Hmm.
Tell me what you think the number one systemic example of systemic racism is in America.
Unfortunately, this video epitomizes everything wrong with Black America. Recently, Larry Elder was invited to be on the Breakfast Club, and you already knew going in that this was going to be a controversial interview. Let's watch how he brings up legitimate complaints, and you'll see a consistent pattern develop as the questions come in from the hosts of the Breakfast Club, Charlemagne and the rest of them. Check it out.
Yeah.
So
Now-
let's jump right into it. Why are you running for president?
Well, I'm running as an America First mega guy, and we have an America First mega guy running, obviously. So the question is, what do you bring to the table?
You said MAGA.
Mega.
Okay.
And the answer is, I bring a lot of issues to the table that I feel our side is not talking enough about, if at all. For example, the number one social problem in America by far is the epidemic, not of COVID, but of fatherlessness.
Larry wastes no time. Does he have a legitimate chance of becoming president? I don't think he does. I think he's a way outsider, even though he's pretty well known. I just think he doesn't really stand a chance personally. What do y'all think? But he dives right in deep, discussing the issues at hand, the most important issues that he believes are impacting our culture, in particularly the Black community. And the response is pretty much what you would think it would be.
70% of Black kids today enter the world without a father in the home, married to the mother, up from 25% back in 1965. Now, 25% of white kids enter the world today without a father in the home, married to the mother. And the stats are clear. Even Barack Obama once cited them. If you're raised without a dad, you're 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. What's happened? In the mid-60s, with I think the best of intentions, a Democrat named Lyndon Johnson launched what he called the War on Poverty. And since then, we have incentivized women to marry the government and incentivized men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. You know, when I say this to people, the pushback I get is, well, there are lots of things that are going on, systemic racism, poverty. Here's the problem. If you look at a young Black male aged 10 to 43, that's young to me because I'm 71 years old. A young Black man in that demo is 13 times more likely to be murdered than a young white man, same demo. Young Black man, real young, 19 and under, the number one cause of preventable death is homicide, almost always at the hands of another young Black male. Same demo for whites, the number one cause of preventable death is unintentional deaths. That includes drug overdoses, automobile accidents, drownings. It's not until they get to number 4 that death is the cause. In America, 60% of the shootings, the robberies, and the homicides are committed by Black people, often against other Black people. Of the homicides in this country, half of them are Black victims, almost all killed by other Blacks. How do you explain that if it isn't for the absence of fathers? Are you prepared to say Black people are just genetically inclined to commit more crime? I doubt it. And the go-to reaction often is poverty and systemic racism. Here's the problem. 1940, when there was blatant racism, this is before Brown versus Board of Education, before the Civil Rights Act of 64, KKK was still alive and well, 87% of Blacks lived under the poverty line. Now it's about 14%. You can't blame it on poverty. You can't blame it on racism. It is the breakdown of the nuclear intact family, and neither side is talking about it. The left doesn't talk about it because they caused it with the welfare state, and our side does not talk about it because if you're white, you'll be accused of dissing single moms who are heroically raising these kids, or you'll be accused of being a racist, or if you're Black, you'll be accused, as I was by the LA Times, of being the black face of white supremacy. Nobody's talking about that. I am.
What are the reasons, if your statistics are right, what are the reasons that you think fathers aren't in the home?
I give them credit for asking, Charlemagne, for asking a follow-up question. Larry broke it down. He broke it down clearly. He said, this is my focus. These are issues that are plaguing the Black community. So let's talk about them instead of burying them or acting as if it's not real. And let's stop placing the blame in various places and address these issues. But let's see Larry's response to this question.
As I said, it's because in the mid-60s, Lyndon Johnson launched what he called the War on Poverty. And Charlemagne, literally, they sent social workers door to door in the inner city. I remember this. advising women of the availability of welfare provided there was no man in the house. It created an economic incentive for women to marry the government. Same thing with whites. In 1965, 8% of whites entered the world without a father in the home, married to the mother. Now it's about 25%, also up threefold. Look at census data, 1910, 1920, 1930, in places like Milwaukee, Chicago, Philadelphia. A young black kid was slightly more likely to be brought into a world with a father in the home, married to the mother, than a young white kid. We have incentivized this kind of bad behavior, and it's had a disproportionately bad effect on the black community.
Makes sense to me. I think he makes a compelling argument. If you listen to Larry's platform, his radio shows, his videos, he consistently points this out to be the problem. And I think that most of us, when we hear this, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, we have to acknowledge the reality of the issues that he brings up. Apart from the spiritual aspect of this, how the church has become less and less, has played less and less of a role in our society. People are becoming increasingly atheistic. The impact of fatherlessness cannot be ignored and it cannot be avoided. It is damaging. It just simply is what it is. And I'm glad to hear somebody bold enough and brave enough to speak out on it consistently. Unfortunately, the response that he gets when he brings this up is pretty typical in the black community.
Let me ask you a question. What do white people do wrong, Larry?
What do you mean? What do white people do? I'm not worried about white people. I'm worried about what's going on with
But
us.
if there's systemic racism in this country, which we know it is.
No, I don't say there is. You say there is. I don't believe that.
Oh, you don't believe there's
No,
systemic
there used to
racism?
be, obviously.
Mm.
Tell me what you think the number one systemic example of systemic racism is in America.
Oh man, there's so
Just
many.
give me the most important one you think.
But at the top of mind, I probably maybe say mass incarceration. Maybe.
Really? During the Great Depression, when 50% of black adults were unemployed, you didn't have this kind of mass incarceration. It's the breakdown of the family. There's a direct.
I'm not going to. I agree with the family part. I'm a black man who is a father to his children, and I'm
Right.
a happily married
Right.
black man to a black woman. So I'm never going to argue with that part,
Mhm.
you know. But I just feel like everything is black with you. Black is wrong. Black people do this and black people do that. And when I asked you what white people do wrong, you said you're not worried about white.
You hear the walls get thrown up. And I understand it to one degree, because anytime someone has a finger pointed at them, and we all do it, we're all guilty of it to some degree. If you're having a conversation with a friend or a family member and they point the finger at you and they tell you that you're doing all these things wrong, you don't know how to talk to people, you're mean, you're whatever the case may be, you're going to throw a wall up and you're going to get pissed off and you're going to get an attitude. Most of us have a tendency to do that. And I think that's one of the main issues, one of the biggest problems in the black community is that we've been indoctrinated not to accept personal responsibility on a large scale. Every time, and all you have to do is listen to the politicians, all you have to do is listen to the mainstream media. And these people like this, the talk show hosts. Anytime there's an issue in the black community, it is we almost never hear anyone say, well, why don't we look at ourselves and examine our own poor choices? What decisions are we making? Who are we associating ourselves with? What actions are we taking that has driven us to have all these issues within our communities? But as soon as someone points it out, and they point it out clearly, they make a solid case for the problems within the black family and what is one of the major causes, you get, well, what do white people do? It's like you being blamed for something you do wrong, but yet you place the blame over, you point the finger over here at someone else. Well, look at what Joe did over here. No, you take responsibility for your actions. And that's how you remedy the solution. Charlemagne said he didn't disagree with them. He acknowledges those things, but instead of saying, okay, well, let's work on that. What are some of the possible solutions for that? The second question out of this man's mouth is, well, what do white people do? At this point in this conversation, and the way the black community has been so jacked up as of late, who cares? Let's fix our own. Let's look in the mirror. Let's fix our own actions. Let's fix our own problems instead of placing blame everywhere. And let's make some changes so we can see the community rise up and not play the victim game all the time. It's really frustrating watching this. Honestly, I really, I was gritting my teeth watching this, knowing that I was going to review this because I knew what was coming, and they didn't disappoint, sadly. But it'll only get worse here shortly.
People at
I'm
all.
talking about the damage, disproportionate damage going on in the Black community. For example, look at these smash and grabs that are taking place in Los Angeles, where I live. There's a suburb called Glendale, where at a mall recently, a mob of 30 to 40 people, they had masks on, but one guy got popped. He was Black. I think most of those who were doing this were Black. And in recent years and times, there have been a number of these in places like Chicago, places like New York. If I were involved in something like that, Charlemagne, I grew up with a dad, just as you're raising your own children. I would have been more afraid of my father than I would about the cops catching me.
He ain't lying there. The same in our household. My biggest concern. Now, I did stupid stuff growing up as a kid. I was out there stealing and doing ignorant stuff when I was a kid, hanging around with the wrong crew, hanging out with my own brothers, doing dumb things on some occasions. But my biggest fear was, and I've told this story on here before, when I caught myself out there living this life of crime, so to speak, when I was like 12, 13 years old, when my mom found out that I was stealing from one of the local convenience stores, all she had to do was threaten to tell my dad. And my life of crime was officially over because all I knew is that if my dad found out that I was stealing, oh my gosh, it would have been horrific. He would have torn me up and I'd have deserved every bit of it. And that just demonstrates what he's talking about. The impact of that the father has in a household is massive, massive in every level. Children are more likely to stay in the faith as far as being Christian and maintain their Christian upbringing when the father is active in the children's lives. And all the statistics he rattled off early on when it comes down to the damage that results from a lack of a father in the home, the pregnancy rate, drug abuse, alcoholism, crime rate, all the things associated with that. It's the impact of the father. It's massive and it can never be overstated.
These kids are afraid of neither. They don't have a father in the home. Cops are demoralized. They're pulling back. Their manpower is short. And as a result, you tell a bad guy you're less likely to be caught, convicted, incarcerated, crime goes up. They may be criminals, but they're not stupid.
Mm-hmm.
When you say, what do white people do? I mean, this is a country that has struggled mightily to get over its historic racism. There was a civil war. There was a big civil rights movement. This is the only majority white country that's ever elected a Black president, let alone reelected a Black president. The three biggest cities in America are New York, Chicago, LA. They all have Black mayors, even though no city has a majority of Black population. The president of Harvard is a Black female. Martin Luther King in 1966, Charlemagne, gave an interview to the BBC. This is 2 years after the Civil Rights Act of 64 got passed. And he said, I'm amazed at how many positive changes there have been in America in the last 2 years. Why, if things keep going like this, we could have a Black president in about 40 years' time.
Mm-hmm.
Do the math. Right on cue, Barack Obama elected 2008. He didn't say there'll be a Black female president of Harvard, and there has been. He didn't say there are going to be Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and there have been several. He didn't say the percentage of the House would equal the percentage of Black people in the population, and it does. He didn't say the three largest cities would have Black mayors, and they do. He didn't say the largest and most prestigious organization of doctors, the American Medical Association, would have 2 Black presidents, and there have been. He didn't say the most prestigious organization of lawyers, the American Bar Association, would have 2 Black presidents, and they have. He said president, meaning at that point, I can feel that I've reached the mountaintop, which is the speech he gave right before he got assassinated, the day before. And now we act as if Barack Obama never even got elected. And we're still talking about systemic racism. It's not fair. It's wrong. And you're discouraging Black people from working hard.
He points out all the ways that the Black community has succeeded, how we've risen above the ugly history in this nation, and how our culture has radically shifted their mindset towards Black folks. Things were about as bad as they could ever be at one point in American history, but we are not there now. We just are not. Yet these issues, talking about how the Black community has risen above, it's almost as if it's taboo nowadays. Like, you can't talk about that. Yes, it may not be the norm, but at the same time, we live in a society to where anybody can rise up and become successful. Anybody, regardless of your skin color. So I just don't understand why, just culturally speaking. I mean, I do know that there's a bigger picture. You keep people angry, and I've mentioned this many times on this channel. You keep people irritated, aggravated, pissed off, angry at the white man, then you have a people who are basically enslaved to, especially if you claim to be the party or the group of people who are pro-black, who talk about systemic racism, then of course you're going to support them. Because when you're told that every problem that plagues the black community is primarily because of racism, whether it's factual or not, whether the data supports it or not, you're going to get people constantly bringing it up. Whether it's the politician or those folks who are in positions of power, media-wise, big tech, you name it, Hollywood, sports, whomever, the music industry, you're constantly reminded of our ugly history. So therefore, you can never separate the current reality, where we are right now. And Larry breaks it all down. He breaks it down so well. It's crazy that there was a time in my life where I looked at this man, I couldn't stand him. But then once I got older and really started examining the things that he says, what he's talking about with reality and looking around, and then when I got into policing, it really impacted me. And I was able to say, man, like what he's saying is legit. And if we put these things into practice, what he talks about, it can only be positive for the black community. It could only be positive for our entire nation. But no, we typically get defensive and aggravated and irritated when someone points out the problems and that we've caused and our own mistakes, our own poor choices. Typically, people get defensive, and this is exactly what we're seeing.
1996.
Okay. Mr. Elder, a quick question. Let's just remove the word racism, since that seems to be a word that triggers, a conversation down the water hole. Let's just focus on the word system.
Okay.
You mentioned that the system was the one that discouraged. And again, we have no problem with agreeing that the family, the black family, should certainly has some room for some improvement. But let's just focus on system.
Room for
You said that the
improvement?
system. Well, we're not going to go down that water. We're
Okay.
not going to go down that water hole. Let's get to the question. So the question is, you said that the system.
Yeah, she doesn't want to go down that path because it's a major conversation, and she probably doesn't want to have that debate.
Encouraged black women to be single mothers, correct?
I said the welfare state, yes.
The welfare, the system. So who's in
Okay.
charge of the system? Who was in charge of the system?
Well, it was Democrats that passed it.
And who were Democrats? Were they black or white at that time?
Well, at the time, majority of black people were Democrats, as the majority of black people are Democrats now.
Not the voters. I'm talking about the system. Remember, the main idea is the word system. Who was in charge of the system at the time? The Democrats at the time, the system. I'm just going to Charlamagne's point about white or black. Was it white Democrats in charge of the system or black Democrats in charge of the system?
Well, if you're prepared to say that Lyndon Johnson did this viciously with an intent to destroy the black family, I disagree. He did it with the best of intentions. And if you look at the New York Times, which is left wing, the Washington Post, which is left wing, they cheered all of this.
Right. And what I'm asking was it white people. So I'm going to ask again in case my mic's not coming through clearly.
It makes me want to shake my head. It's sister girl over here with this attitude, but like what he's saying is problematic. You acknowledge it on one hand, but yet you have a problem with what he's bringing up. Now, that's a legitimate question. You can ask that question. Who was in charge of the system at that time? But at the same time, his argument, Larry's argument, is that, yeah, white folks, and he'll get into this here in a second, white folks were clearly in charge at the time. They have always been the majority in our nation. I don't know whether LBJ had positive intentions, or he may have. I think he probably had dual intentions. I think that he was probably getting encouragement from the black community to assist them, to help them get out of poverty and be in positions where they can be more successful, considering they were just coming out of and still dealing with the repercussions of Jim Crow, and the civil rights laws were being enacted at that time. So I think he may have had, on one hand, okay intentions, but we also know at the same time that it has been historically recognized that he knew that doing something like this, providing systems to help black folks get out of poverty, he also knew that that would basically enslave us or endear the Democratic Party to black folks, or at least it's claimed that he said that he'll have these N words voting Democrat for the next, I can't recall, 100 years, 200 years, something like that. So whether he had good intentions or not, I think that's questionable. Going back to his primary statement, he's talking about the reality of fatherlessness and how it has impacted our communities, and how most of that are choices that we've made. And then she's got this old smug attitude, like she's waiting for the gotcha question, jumping in and making her little statements, got her little attitude, and she's going to bounce out of here. Tell me where he's wrong. That's what I would love for her to address. Where is he wrong in that? And he's talking about history. And if you're talking about history in the black community, he is addressing history, but he's also talking about current day, the impact, how things have shifted over the last 60 years or so.
Was it white people in charge of the system or black people in charge of that system that helped break down the black family? It's a simple yes, just a simple question, white or black?
Well, you didn't have to go on welfare unless you voluntarily chose to go on welfare. The inducement was put there by Democrats, by
White
the
Democrats,
left.
correct? Okay. White
Well,
Democrats, correct.
most black people were Democrats, and they voted for these white people
Not
too.
voters. I said who's in charge of the
Who's in charge?
system?
Well, who
was in charge?
Who put them in charge?
Was Lyndon Johnson
Who put
white
them-
or black?
Who put them in
And maybe
charge?
that'll help you.
Fine, Lyndon Johnson was white.
Thank you.
Okay. But if
Charlamagne?
your argument is that the reason he did it is because of racism, then I
No.
disagree. He did it because of
That's not my argument. I just asked you a simple question. Was he white or black? Charlamagne?
And you see that she doesn't want to really go back and forth. She just wants to jump in, get her little gotcha question, and then bounce out. Okay, it is what it is. It was a majority white country who came up with these principles. And he's saying, but it's still at the core, it's still the Democratic Party. Their policies are a massive part, play a major role in where we are today. And yet we don't acknowledge that massive role. I don't think welfare is a evil in and of itself, but when you have people, individuals whose families have stayed on it, and when the overall impact of it is fathers not being in the home, it has been absolutely destructive. So throwing the little gotcha question that white people were the ones who were making these rules and these laws, but at the same time, the goal was to benefit black folks, to benefit minorities.
And Mr. Elder, you said you talked about the smash and grabs, right? And I find that interesting because when you see the mass shootings that happen, majority of those people are white males. What do you think about that?
Actually, if you look at the percentage of whites in America, which is 60%, the percentage of mass shooters is under that. The percentage of people that commit hate crime is under that. The percentage of people who are serial killers is under that. Black people are 13% of the population. We commit a greater percentage compared to that
But no,
of
you
mass
specifically
shootings.
talked about the smash and grabs, though. So I was saying, since you're using that as an example, I'm saying, well, what about the mass shooters that are usually white males?
One more time, they are usually white males because 60% of the country is white. However, they underrepresent in terms of the number of mass shootings.
He's nailing it 100% again. When you look at the rate of mass shootings in relation to the percentage of the population of white people, you'll see that they are typically underrepresented in the violent crime. As opposed to when you look at the black community, you'll see that we typically overrepresent in the area of violent crime. We'll make up 12% of the population or so. And oftentimes when you look at all violent crime in general, we'll typically make up around 30%, 25 or 30%, if my numbers are correct from the last time I examined those numbers. Another point real quick, mass shootings can be really subjective, that term, because it depends on the jurisdiction of the law enforcement agency. The definition can shift. The FBI may have a higher number. A local police department may have a smaller number. FBI may say like 5 or more. A local police department may say 4 or 3 or something like that. So it's kind of hard to really nail down what that means. But I also recall reading one point at one time that drive-by shootings that typically happen in the inner city aren't typically added to the equation when it comes down to determining who does the most mass shootings. So we can't ignore that. But back to his primary point is that us black folks are in the minority when it comes to as far as how we represent here in the United States. but we are disproportionately involved in crime, violent crime, than other ethnic groups.
About 50% or so of the mass shootings in this country are committed by white people, even though white people are 60% of the population. They underrepresent. We overrepresent when it comes to hate crime, when it comes to mass shootings, when it comes to serial killings, when it comes to robberies, when it comes to virtually every category of violent crime. We overrepresent.
So what do white people do wrong? I'm gonna keep asking you that.
My goodness, it's so frustrating to watch. This is where the conversation should be going. Okay, so how do we understand that the lack of fatherlessness is playing a significant role? How do you plan on fixing that if you're president? Let's move the questions on instead of trying to say, well, look at what they're doing over there. What do white people do wrong? Man, as long as we have this mentality, I'm telling y'all, as long as we keep this mentality, pointing at fingers at everywhere else instead of examining ourselves, our own actions in the mirror, we will continue to be held down, and we will continue to stay at only 12% when we're killing each other in the womb, when we're killing each other on the streets. Another point that is typically overlooked in this entire conversation are the Black victims. The vast majority of people who are victimized by the high crime rate, violent crime rate in the Black community are other Black folks. But they don't want to talk about that, I guess. And it's part and parcel to everything that we're seeing over the last few years. More and more, as time goes on, no one wants to acknowledge the issues. When was the last time you saw CNN or NBC News, ABC, CBS, or MSNBC highlight the violent crime in the Black community and actually ask questions as to what can we do to fix our own problems? You probably haven't seen it, and you probably never will. Because when it's all said and done, it's always the white man's fault. It's ridiculous.
Well,
Like,
it seems to me, rather than deal with what's going on, the pathology that's going on in the inner city, you want me to talk about how bad white people are,
No,
which I don't think is a particularly productive thing to do.
Well, I think
I'm talking.
there's a cause and effect, but if we can't talk about the cause, which I believe is systemic racism and white supremacy, the FBI said.
Well, I just told you, if it's systemic racism, please explain to me how it was when America really had systemic racism in 1940. 87% of Blacks lived under the poverty line. Again, this is during Jim Crow era. My father is from Athens, Georgia, grew up in Jim Crow. My mom is from Huntsville, Alabama, grew up in Jim Crow. 87% of Blacks live below the poverty line. This is before Brown versus Board of Education. You did not find these kind of black on black crime.
Probably because we had no
But they
choice
still
but
were
to do it
living
ourselves.
below the poverty line, though, sir.
I'm sorry?
You're forgetting the fact that they were still living below the poverty line. You're picking and choosing, saying this was good, but this was bad.
Okay.
The bottom line, they end between the poverty line. But let's move forward.
Two things can be true at the same time. All Charlemagne is doing is just trying to deflect to another problem. Then old sister girl, I don't even know her name, but she chimes in and she's saying that there was a time where they were below the poverty line, but change doesn't happen overnight. And his argument, if I'm not mistaken, just is similar to Thomas Sowell's, was that we really didn't need the welfare state because things were already improving. We were growing as far as economically and exponentially on our own. All we needed was a fair shake. So he's saying, so why are things worse now when it comes to black on black crime, the violent crime rate, more Black folks being locked up? Why is it more prevalent now than back in the day when we were more likely to be victimized and be mistreated in the legal system? Why are we locked up at a higher rate now than we were back then? It's a simple question, but none of them at no point want to address it.
Can I just address that? In 1940, 87% of Blacks lived under the poverty line. 1960, that number had fallen to 47%. That's a 40-point drop in 20 years.
Exactly.
That's the greatest 20-year period of economic expansion for Black people in the history of America. Again, well before Brown versus Board of Education, well before the KKK imploded, well before we had race-based preferences. Why? Because it was rare for a Black kid to be raised in a family without a father in the home. A strong belief in Judeo-Christian values, a belief in patriotism, even as America wasn't applying these values to Black people, obviously, and a belief in entrepreneurship. All those things are now under assault by organizations like Black Lives Matter. Charlemagne, Black Lives Matter had on their website an attack on the nuclear family. The founders are self-described Marxists, trained Marxists. Marx wanted to dethrone God, was an atheist, and Marx did not believe in capitalism, let alone entrepreneurship. All the things that made Black people still survive in virulent racism are now under attack by organizations like Black Lives
But
Matter.
all of those things have always been under attack by white supremacy. You can go back to things like whether it's the Tulsa race massacres, like every time Black people do create these systems that are our systems and we are the entrepreneurs, it seems like white supremacy finds a way to destroy it.
Every time, look, the Tulsa massacre, within about 5 years, that whole area was rebuilt. It was not even called the Black Wall Street until after it was rebuilt. And it was rebuilt, by the way, by Black people without one dime of government money.
Yeah, but who destroyed it to begin with?
It was racists who destroyed it. No question about it.
Just making
We've
sure.
had race riots, but so have Japanese.
So you do agree that there's racism? I'm just so confused.
You know,
Mr. Elder,
I never even came close to saying. I never came close to saying there was no racism.
You just said you don't think it's systemic racism.
Not anymore. Obviously, there was. We had something called slavery. We had something called Jim Crow.
That destroyed Black. Hold on, sir. That was system that destroyed. That was the system that destroyed Black Wall Street. It's the same system right now that's not even wanting to pay those same living descendants, because I know your position on reparations, but those same living descendants of Black Wall Street.
Okay.
And then you move, and then you go on to say that the system, the quote unquote system, is also trying to destroy President Trump. So
I don't know what's so confusing, what's so difficult for her to understand. At one point, there was a high level of racism in the system 50, 60 plus years ago. Today, the culture has shifted dramatically. So now you have the deep state that's very clear. Like, if you don't like Donald Trump, all you have to do is honestly say, okay, look how they're coming after this dude. Let's just say the allegations against Trump were legit. You think which I don't believe. Would you honestly believe that there hasn't been any other politician, any other president in our history who hasn't done the exact same thing in various situations or similar things, but never were attacked to the level that he was? So what I'm saying is systems can and have shifted historically. So there's no major confusion as to what's going on. It's common sense. All you have to do is pay attention. It could be two different systems that occupy and control a culture over the course of years. Things can shift dramatically. Look at how culture has shifted and changed regarding the gay marriage issue or anything related to the LGBT movement. There was a time, all the things that we're battling nowadays, transitioning kids, gender pronouns, proper pronouns, and people losing their jobs and their careers over holding to Christian values, that wouldn't have been the case 30, 40 years ago. Heck, that wouldn't even have been the case 20 years ago, largely. But now this is something that we're battling. Why? Because mindsets change, cultures change. Sometimes from bad to worse, sometimes from good to bad, sometimes from bad to good. It happens. It's just a reality of it. So I wish you was in studio. I wish it could have been a one-on-one conversation with this woman and Larry Elder, but which I know wouldn't happen because just like on The View, it's like a 3 against 1. I don't think they know what to do with his factual arguments. That's why every time he brings it up, this constant shifting of the argument.
Confused on, do you believe that the system can destroy or not? You pick and choose, sir, and that's what's so confusing to me. You just said it wasn't racism. Now it is racism. When it was time to build it back,
I said it
there
wasn't,
was no racism.
I said it wasn't systemic racism. Let's talk about.
So what are you just hung up on the word system?
Can I just make this point, Charlamagne, please? Let's take Chinese Americans. Chinese Americans were the first ethnic group to be excluded with an Immigration Act in the late 1800s. They had riots against Chinese in LA, in San Francisco. There were laws that prevented Chinese Americans from participating in the laundry business. I'm in California. California, of course, rounded up Japanese Americans during World War II. There were laws that prevented Japanese Americans from owning farmland. The average Japanese American household has a higher per capita income than the average white household. The average Chinese American household has a higher per capita income than the average white household. How does that happen? It happens because of a strong belief in family. It is rare for a Chinese American or a Japanese American kid to have a child outside of wedlock, and a strong belief in education and a strong belief in entrepreneurship. These are the kinds of qualities that make people successful.
You blame everything on having a fatherless family, right? Because
I didn't say blaming everything.
I know, but that's what you're saying. You're saying a strong community. But
no, you said that's what I just said. I didn't say that.
You talk about the Asian community. Asian community, it's easy for them to get loans for entrepreneurships. easy for them to get loans for houses. You look at our community.
Okay.
If you really want to talk about our community, right? You look at the schools in our community. Some of our schools are the worst, right? Would you agree with that? Yes or no?
Absolutely. Which
Right,
is why,
they don't have Wi-Fi, don't have education, don't have
one of
books.
the reasons I'm running for president is for school
Also,
choice.
would you say that it's in our
That's
community
also
is
systemic. by the
it's
way.
also in our communities heavy food deserts. There's nothing but fast food places that are just killing and destroying that. Would you say that's true?
Systemic too. by the way.
Boy,
Would you say that's true? I'm just asking a question.
Okay, you said a number of things. I just addressed one of them about
Sure.
loans.
Mhm.
In 1965, Barack Obama, who was in private practice, joined a bunch of other lawyers to file a class action lawsuit against Citicorp, which is headquartered here in New York. 186 Black people were applying for loans for mortgages. They didn't get them. And they accused Citicorp of engaging in racism.
Mhm.
Citicorp said, no, it's not racism. You have poor credit scores, and we want to make sure we get our money back. Obama joined a bunch of other lawyers, and they sued Citicorp in a class action lawsuit. And Citicorp said, okay, to hell with it. Gave them all loans. And they followed them all up. Daily Caller did a few years later. Almost all of them lost their homes. Several of them filed for bankruptcy. One of them even said, when you don't qualify for a loan, maybe we shouldn't get a loan. Well, duh. It wasn't true that Black people were not getting loans.
Man, I've grown to appreciate Larry Elder so much is because of every argument that he gets involved in, he brings the truth, the facts. He brings the uncomfortable truths that we often don't want to hear. These allegations of racism, they throw them out there left and right. Hard to get loans, food deserts, so on and so forth. Typically, where do these food deserts arise? They arise in violent communities. His point with the Asian community is so spot on, because there have been so many times where there have been other societies, other cultures in our country who were treated maybe not nearly as bad in our country, but have had historically poor treatment in their own country or across the world. Every society has been enslaved at one point or another. Basically, every society has. But yet somehow in the Black community, we can't seem to get ahead. And I don't think it's because we're inept. I think it has a lot to do with Black culture, as far as the hip hop culture or the thug culture, to be specific. I'll link the full interview below. I might even do a follow-up video on some of the other points, but excellent job done by Larry. He went into enemy territory and more than held his own. He kept his cool. I mean, granted, he's been doing this for decades, dealing with these arguments, so he knows his stuff. But let's start looking at the actual problem. Let's stop blaming racism for everything, because if we continue to do that, we will truly never rise above. But before you go, make sure you check out this video right here. I think you'll find it very helpful and informative.